Outrage in California after another unarmed man is shot dead by a police officer. We examine police tactics in the US. Is this law enforcement or institutionalized brutality? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Extreme police tactics aren't a new phenomenon in the United States, but in the age of social media, police violence, such as the shooting of unarmed people, the use of pepper spray and taser guns, are being documented for the world to see.
You can't breathe, officer.
The Occupy protesters throughout the country felt the full force of police tactics, many subject to violent arrest. And perhaps the most controversial example was at the University of California, Davis, where peaceful protesters were pepper sprayed last November. It's more than 20 years since a recording of police violence sparked riots in Los Angeles. The beating of Rodney King was caught on video. The footage shocked the world. But 2 decades later, how much has changed? The city of Anaheim in California is today being compared to a powder keg after both the latest fatal police shooting and the manner in which the police dealt with the subsequent protests. Al Jazeera's Rob Reynolds is there for us.
Outrage over a pair of fatal police shootings spills into the streets in Anaheim. Things got ugly Tuesday night after protesters attempted to attend a city council meeting but were barred from entering City Hall by police who said the meeting room was full. People began throwing rocks and bottles at police and setting fire to trash cans. Hundreds of police in riot gear responded by firing non-lethal rounds into the crowd. At least 6 people were injured and police made 24 arrests. City officials defended their response. The community has erupted in fury following 2 deadly police shootings of young Latino men. On Saturday, police shot and killed an unarmed man who they said was running away from them, hitting him in the leg and the back of the head. Police said he and another young man shot dead the following day were both gang members. But local residents say they were victims of racial profiling and an overly aggressive police force.
I've lived in this community my whole life, and it's sad when you have to be scared for your kids to go outside.
There have been 6 fatal police shootings in Anaheim this year. Clashes between protesters and police have gone on for several days and nights. Anaheim is a city perhaps best known as the location of Disneyland, which is nicknamed the happiest place on earth. But Anaheim is far from a happy place this week. It's a simmering powder keg of racial tension. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Anaheim, California.
So is policing in the United States becoming increasingly militarized? To discuss this, we're joined by Jumana Musa. She's a human rights lawyer who is deputy director of the Rights Working Group. In Orange County, California, we have Gustavo Arellano, the editor of the OC Weekly, a newspaper that has been covering the shootings extensively. And we're joined by Raymond Lewis, a retired Philadelphia police captain who was arrested by New York police recently while taking part in the Occupy Wall Street protests late last year. First of all, Gustavo Arellano, the protests do continue. Do they feel that their complaints are being heard about the most recent shootings?
Absolutely not. And it's not just about the recent shootings. In Anaheim, within the past year, the past 12 months, there's been 8 officer-involved shootings, 7 of which resulted in deaths. And before that, there were other officer-involved shootings. And before that, there's been a long just distrust of the police department in Anaheim. So these past 2 killings, they were just a spark that lit a fire that was years in the making. The protest last night, there was also heavy police tactics, the use of pepper balls, the use of bean bags, the arrests of people. And some people, let's face it, some people were vandalizing under law. They're supposed to be arrested. But if you're arresting people or you're intimidating them just because they're protesting, well, that's not a real good way, that's not a real good community outreach, especially when it is such a volatile situation.
And we'll take a closer look at the policing of such protests a bit later. But as far as the circumstances of Manuel Diaz's killing, which are particularly controversial, are those becoming any clearer?
No, not at all. Well, it's interesting because the people there on the ground, the residents, they say that Manuel Diaz was shot in the back once or in his leg. That's a conflicting report, but then shot in the head. He was, they said he wasn't resisting by that point. He had been shot. The police department, on the other hand, say that yes, Manuel Diaz was found unarmed, but before that, he ran away from police, and when they finally cornered him, they say, reached into his waistband, at which point the police officers shot. That, so there is going to be disputes. But what's more disturbing, the OC Weekly, we obtained video showing that in the immediate aftermath of Diaz's shooting, he was there lying on the ground twitching. The police department did nothing for 3 minutes. Instead, they were more interested in trying to shoo away onlookers who were recording with the video camera and blocking those people who were recording actually with their smartphones, blocking people from documenting what was going on. It wasn't until about 3 minutes afterwards they finally flipped his body over, at which point you could see the bloodied head of Diaz. That's what outraged people, not so much the shootings. Unfortunately, shootings are going to happen, but when you're so cavalier about them, that's when people are going to get upset.
Captain Lewis, I suppose that distinction then between Diaz running away and reaching into his armband is quite important, because the rules of engagement suggest, the police can't simply shoot you for running away, can they?
No, absolutely not. And even it's question when somebody sticks their hand in their waistband, if you don't have a gun, you're giving the police a real clear reason to shoot you. Subsequently, I don't see any reason why someone would reach into their waistband if they did not have a weapon.
And, the other question is, he'd already been shot and incapacitated once. The eyewitness reports suggest he was then shot, once in the leg or in the upper thigh, and then subsequently he was shot in the head while he was incapacitated. Does that conform to the rules of engagement?
You only continue shooting as long as the individual presents a continuing threat. And once that threat is eliminated, there's no need for any more shooting or any type of physical violence. When
questioned about this, though, the police union has said, well, he was a known gang member with a criminal record. It's quite perplexing, I suppose, as to why that, could that be a justification? Or is that justification quite worrying in itself, actually?
That's embarrassing. To me, that is totally embarrassing for the police union to even mention his record. That has absolutely nothing to do with the justification of the shooting.
And then the point that Gustavo points out, and perhaps we can take a closer look actually at that video, once Diaz is on the ground, there's no attempt made, and he's still alive, we understand, he dies later, there is no attempt made to help him whatsoever.
It's unjustifiable to say that they were shooing away witnesses with cameras and they took that as a priority over getting that individual medical care immediately. It's unjustifiable.
Jamal Musa, as an attorney, what do you make of all this?
Well, I think just like Gustavo said, right, this has been a long brewing issue. This isn't something that happened on Saturday. It's not something that started on Saturday. It's not something that started this year or this decade, right? Because what we see, a lot of the roots of this are issues of race and class. Racial profiling is real. People are treated differently in the criminal justice system. So when you look at a group of people and you criminalize them by saying, this is a neighborhood with a lot of crime, it's a high crime area, this is an area with a lot of drug dealers, these people are gang members, it dehumanizes them, and it makes them fair targets in a lot of ways. So the answer is they're dangerous, and that's the mindset you go in with. And so anything they do then is interpreted as dangerous. Whereas if you approached a situation where you didn't have that preformed idea of who you're dealing with, you might actually interact with the situation differently.
Now, I wonder whether that's going to be a useful analysis as we move on to the next stage of this story, which is the subsequent protests. And there's video of pandemonium as police fire into a crowd of terrified men, women, and children. A police dog was unleashed, but the police say that was inadvertent. But there is footage of people being bitten. In one case, a man is attempting to protect his baby from the police dog. Unfortunately, we don't have rights to that particular video. It is widely available on the internet, though. But the official version as to how that occurred is this from the Anaheim Police Department. As officers awaited the arrival of the district attorney investigators, a large crowd of people gathered and began to encroach on the scene. Officers attempted to detain an instigator, at which time the crowd became unruly. Both non-lethal and less than lethal methods were deployed to control the unrest. As this was occurring, a police service dog unintentionally escaped a police car and inadvertently entered the crowd, injuring one male, as reported to the police department. We assisted with his medical treatment. The incident is now under internal investigation. But we do also have other explanations, this time some eyewitness accounts from what appear to be pretty credible witnesses.
The police grabbed a woman, and then they started shooting, And then I ran, but I didn't know they shot me. But then I just felt something like it was burning my feet, my leg.
And the police released the dog, and the dog started to chase people around. They're saying that they let the dog go in accident, but it wasn't purpose.
Yeah.
And they would tell the dog to stop, but then he just kept on going. Are they running? Then me and my sister just ran because they like shooting. Yeah. And we were all scared.
Did any other children get hit with rubber bullets?
A 5-year-old girl got hit in the eye.
And a boy in the feet.
Because you heard that from them. The police started shooting innocent people with those little
rubber bullets.
Yeah, those rubber bullets.
Gustavo, Ariano, are we getting a better idea of what exactly happened there?
Oh, it's absolute chaos. What you could tell even from the video that is going around the world showing the police dog going after, just running around, is you see terrified parents on the ground shielding their children while the Anaheim Police Department is pointing their so-called less than lethal, or what is the other one, non-lethal weapons at them. If people are attacking the Anaheim police, again, by law, they're entitled to go after them and target them. But to the point of making innocent people crouch down and terrorizing them, and then the police dog just goes off and firing. If you're hitting children, then you're not a good police officer. You are not, what do children have to do with the bad guys at hand? It's a fiasco all around. And of course, their internal investigation, other investigations will get to the bottom of this, but you can't deny the bruises on children. You can't deny their stories, and you can't deny that if that's happening in a scene, no matter what the scene may be, that's not good policing.
Captain Lewis, when is it permissible to draw guns on a crowd of unarmed men, women, and children? When is it permissible to shoot at unarmed children?
When you feel your life or the life of a citizen is in danger of death or serious bodily injury.
What is the goal in crowd control situations like this? Is it to calm things down, or is it to mete out punishment? I mean, looking at that footage, it is a bit perplexing as to what those officers are trying to achieve.
I would like to have seen the 3 to 5 minutes prior to that, because I certainly did not see any, quote, unruly crowd. From my experiences of 10 years of patrol in Philadelphia, I would have classified that as a Sunday school picnic, okay? But they obviously, hopefully, they saw something that I did not see. I have never been on a demonstration or a riotous situation where you had so many mothers holding their children. That alone, to me, tells me a lot about the demonstration. And as for the dog, even if the dog did get out accidentally, that dog was terribly trained, and that reflects on the officer's training. That dog should never have attacked unless commanded to attack. It should have stopped immediately, given a command, Duke, halt. And once it bit that individual, it should have released by Duke, release. That individual officer was trying to pull that dog off. That dog was totally, totally out of control and not trained. And I saw a lot of untrained officers in that situation.
What about consideration in those situations? I mean, is it too much to ask then? Once pandemonium does break out, are officers thinking about the long-term consequences of their actions, or is it simply about the short-term, well, we've got to do something? I mean, some perceived
short-term. They're thinking of short-term, and they should be. At that point in time, you should not be thinking of long-term solutions. That's the time.
But even though, the fact that they are now pointing their weapons and shooting at women and children effectively, isn't someone thinking about that perhaps?
Well, the short-term solution takes care of any other long-term solution. In that, do I have the right to shoot this firearm now?
Well, that's another interesting point. I mean, when do you fire rubber bullets? I mean, you say, but not just those, but these. I mean, again, there are all these sort of benign terms under, non-lethal rounds. We have now beanbag rounds, pepper bag rounds, not to mention pepper spray, which we've seen used in other things. I mean, do they all have different moments in which they are permissible to be used?
From my experience, we never had those when I retired 8 years ago.
Right.
And we didn't have, it was either a bullet or nothing, or the stick. But I would imagine that they are all used in similar situations. I don't think there's distinct situations where you would use a rubber bullet or a beanbag or a pepper spray.
Jemana, perhaps you can help. I mean, what are the rules of engagement with these supposed, I think we've used the term non-lethal.
I think the terminology is problematic because rubber bullets can and have been lethal. tasers are called less than lethal weapons, but also have been lethal, and we've seen that in more than one case. And so, you know, a question of where do you use it on the use of force continuum is a very technical question, but the idea that we're just using non-lethal things somehow seems like it's not as big a deal. And if you're actually shooting them into crowds of women and children, small children, that really leads me to question, how are they approaching a use of force continuum anyway? Because you were asking the pandemonium question, like how are they trying to contain pandemonium? Again, I didn't see it 5 minutes before, I wasn't there, but it looks to me like they were creating pandemonium.
Right, exactly. And of course, this idea of lethality. I mean, pepper bags, bean bags, pepper spray. I mean, they have a pretty devastating effect on people.
Oh, and then the point is, you don't know what you're shooting into in the crowd. What if one of those children had asthma and they start sending pepper bombs in? You don't know what you're shooting into. So, I mean, I think the larger consideration is not what weapons are they shooting at people, but why are they actually using these weapons on the people, including a crowd full of children?
Well, Captain, help us understand that. And Jumana's already perhaps touched on this, but I guess the key to understanding these police tactics, I suppose, is to understand the attitude the police have towards those that they police. I mean, do you think that's probably the question then?
Oh, absolutely. From day one in my career, protesters were always equated with troublemakers. And that is the fault of supervision, all the way up to the mayor. Okay, you should not have the aspect of protesters being troublemakers. And I can guarantee you, before these officers went out to that detail of the protest, the sergeant at roll call probably said, guys, be aware, we're going to have some troublemakers out of 52nd Street or whatever street it was. Right away, all the officers get in their mind, hey, these guys are the enemy. Instead of him saying, we have some people exercising their First Amendment rights, and we're going to have to patrol it.
And Gustavo, I mean, I know that very quickly, though, can you just explain how this fits into the specific context of Anaheim and its particular fault lines?
Sure. What happens with Anaheim then is you've actually had a couple of mothers whose children have been killed by police officers for the past couple of years protesting outside the Anaheim police station, and they've always been treated as kooks. Oh, you know, they're just protesting, they're troublemakers. So when you start having more people that are aggrieved, the police department is going to come with this mentality. It's us versus them, and we essentially have to school them. And, you know, when you have something like that, that is a recipe for trouble.
So is there anything new, though, about the police tactics as such there, or is it, and their approach to disadvantaged communities in particular, whether black or white, for that matter, or Latino or anything? Or is it the fact that now the role of cell phone cameras is so widespread that we are actually seeing it a great deal? There were reports that police in Anaheim asked to buy the footage at the time, Gustavo. I mean, do you think that's why, I mean, that's what makes all this striking? I mean, this has always, frankly, happened, perhaps. But now we're actually
Well, no, actually,
it
hasn't happened. In this day and age, of the internet now, we have community journalists. Before,
no, I know the violence has always happened.
Someone. Yeah, the violence is always happening. A police officer could kill someone indiscriminately or just beat people up, and then when it came to a court of law, the police officer could say, hey, I'm a police officer, I felt I was threatened, I'm justified, and a jury, especially in Orange County, would find it in their favor. Now, though, with community videotaping, everything has changed. Last year in Orange County, in the city of Fullerton, right next to Anaheim, police officers beat to death a homeless man by the name of Kelly Thomas. And the initial media report said there was an altercation, a violent scuffle between this homeless man and the police officers, and everybody was believing what the police officers were saying. It wasn't until a local blog named Friends for Fullerton's Future, they published the picture of Thomas's bruise. I mean, he looked like an eggplant. His face was so brutalized that people eventually realized that there was something more to this than what the police department was saying. Then videotape started emerging, and because of that, now you have two police officers that are going to be in trial.
And I see actually behind us they're playing the Rodney King footage, which of course was one of the biggest examples of this. But these are happening more and more. But
Let me interject a little bit about the protesters being seen as the enemy and whatnot. That is a natural evolution of a police officer's mindset, because especially with an inner city police officer, I'm giving the other perspective now.
Yeah.
What happens is police officers are just constantly called to events where they have to confront somebody. They don't get called to weddings when everybody's getting along. They get called to weddings when the reception gets rowdy and everybody's drunk. They don't get called to birthday parties.
Perhaps they might get invited to more birthdays.
Okay. Yeah. But they get called constantly to areas, to scenes where there are troublemakers. Even your most common call, a disturbance house where two people or three people are
just
fighting.
Just widen this out a bit, though, because as we investigate...
Can I just say something to that, though? Because,
Very
I mean,
quickly.
I think that's the whole point of the job, right? If you want to get invited for birthday parties and other gatherings, you're a clown or a musician. But if you're a police officer, your whole existence is to go to scenes and not exacerbate the scene,
But we are still human. We are still human.
But the training, then? What about the training to make sure that you don't overreact like any of us would in an insane situation?
You can have that training, and you need that training, and you need more of it.
Right.
But I'm still saying there is a natural evolution that you cannot get away from, because we're not robots. And you are going to develop that it's always me against. In fact, there's a common saying in police work. There's two types of people, police and a-holes.
Well, at that point then, because I think that is also quite instructive as we move on, because
Nice to know.
as we investigate patterns of police behaviour, a report has just come out now on the police tactics during the Occupy Wall Street protests and the Occupy protests elsewhere, no, but mainly focusing on Wall Street, from the New York University School of Law and the Fordham Law School. These are the main findings. They say the police used, quote, aggressive, unnecessary and excessive force against protesters, bystanders, legal observers and journalists. The report also presents evidence that NYPD officers obstructed press freedom and monitored peaceful political activity. The report concludes that NYPD practices not only violate US and international law, they undermine individual liberty, inhibit collective debate, and suppress the right to protest. So that's just come out today, and in fact the recommendations are that an independent inspector general for the NYPD be appointed, an investigation and prosecution of responsible officers takes place, because so far only one NYPD officer has been disciplined as far as we know, and the creation of new NYPD policing guidelines. But this does once again raise that question, Captain, who or what are the police protecting in situations, whether it's in a disadvantaged neighborhood in California or at a protest on Wall Street in New York?
Protecting, basically, they're supposed to be protecting the welfare, the bodily safety of the individuals there, and also property. And if they're not protecting either one of those, there's no reason for this aggression.
But then again, so I mean, I think you probably have actually answered this. As we look at some of the more egregious footage from Occupy and elsewhere, which thankfully we have footage of, what do they think they're achieving as they're attacking peaceful protesters on the ground?
Well, in attacking peaceful protest, they're trying to apprehend them and get them arrested. I don't know exactly how peaceful some of them are sometimes. There's always you're going to fight back.
Right.
And when you see them as the enemy, and when they give the slightest fighting back, what happens is a switch goes on. Okay, and that switch is the fight or flight mode. Police cannot flee, so they go into that fight mode.
Right.
As soon as there's any type of pushback, and you cannot just turn off that fight mode with a switch.
But actually, as a lawyer, very quickly, if one's being attacked by a police officer and we're entirely peaceful, do you have any right to fight back, though, or not?
I'll just tell you my off-the-record opinion: don't resist a police officer. But I think there's something we're missing here, which is how do we get to the point where it's the us versus them, and I'm the a-hole and he's a police officer, right? So you're talking about certain cultures that are in place where there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of accountability. So it's not the one incident. I mean, you want to talk about NYPD and Occupy Wall Street, you can talk about NYPD and Stop and Frisk and the fact that they treat every black and brown man as suspect, no matter what neighborhood they're in. And that results in death, like the shooting over Marley Graham. The fact that they'll surveil every Muslim in not just the city, but anywhere surrounding the city, in Pennsylvania, New Jersey.
So there are these patterns of abuse then, whether in Anaheim or in New York.
But there's no accountability and there's no transparency, and I think that just lends itself to a culture that perpetuates this behavior.
And that's the question. I mean, where do they get the idea that this is acceptable behavior? When you look at some of this behavior, it does seem as if they feel this is part of their job. And again, it's only because it's recorded so often that we get to see what probably has been happening for decades, basically.
Absolutely, this is what's been happening for decades. And it's amazing this is happening. This is how strong that response is, because they know they're being filmed, but that response is so strong that it overcomes the fact that, hey, I'm being filmed.
What about this idea of militarization then? Did you get the sense that the police have been, we've only got a minute left, the police have been militarized? Do you think, I mean, the rhetoric of the war on terror has somehow kind of got into all of this? You're either with us or against us, or is this just only because we're discovering it now that we're actually putting on, recent tropes onto this?
I think we're seeing it happen across the border with Border Patrol and the way they treat residents. I encourage you to look at PBS Need to Know. They've been covering killings and torture and other assaults by Border Patrol that are unaccountable, again on video. But, I mean, you look at the fact that They're getting new toys. They're given military equipment. They're using drones. There was a sheriff in Texas who actually wanted drones to shoot their less than lethal weapons at crowds. And so they're actually not just taking on military language and military postures, they're getting military equipment in terms of doing their job. And that's the way they're approaching the communities that they police in, which they're actually supposed to protect and serve.
All right, well, we'll leave it there for the moment. For our television broadcast segment of this, Jumana Musa, thank you very much. Gustavo Arellano, thank you very much. Captain Lewis, too, thank you. We'll probably go on for an extra 5 minutes or so. We'll put that on the internet. But that's it for the moment from the team in Washington, D.C. To continue then, what about answers then? Clearly, a big part of this then is internal investigations. We've mentioned that already. This idea of impunity, the idea that actually that you can carry on like this, would appear, I mean, am I wrong to suggest there might be a relationship between that and the lack of real investigation, Captain Lewis?
Absolutely. This comes, the type of behavior you're seeing is due to the lack of accountability for years and years and years. And the mayor, it all goes back to the mayor, because the police commissioner answers to the mayor. If the mayor put his foot down and told the police commissioner, this is the type of police department I want, and you'll be out of here if I don't get that type of police department, you'd see a different police department. The mayors are not pressing the police commissioners enough.
What is that relationship like then? Is that part of it there?
Too often the police commissioner or the police chief rules the band.
Right. I mean, there's some questions about whether Bloomberg actually has control over his.
That's the epitome of a mayor having no control over a police department.
As an attorney, then, what's to be done then?
Well, I think this is where we look for federal legislation. We look for state and city legislation. We look for federal guidance. So in New York City, they've actually introduced laws against racial profiling, the use of race and other factors in policing. Because there's a difference between whether you use race as a descriptor, there's this suspect, blah, 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 versus as a predictor of criminality. So these people, because they're dressed this way, because they look this way, because they talk this way, because they gather this way, they are criminal, therefore we treat them differently. It's almost like a way of ranking rights. So if you at least ban that at the outset with things like federal legislation, the Anti-Racial Profiling Act, that says you cannot actually use that in your consideration, it doesn't fix the problem, but it starts us down a road of standards and accountability, where we could say, perhaps you didn't act right. It happens in every kind of organization, law enforcement, something else. But we know these are the standards, we know they're going to be enforced, and it's going to be transparent. So what happens when something goes down, when someone is beaten to death on camera, like Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, who was beaten to death in San Diego in front of many witnesses, many cameras, which at the time Border Patrol actually erased some of those videos. They took people's phones and erased videos. There's not 2 years where nobody knows anything and nothing happens. And only when his mother comes here, only when there's press, only when there's a documentary, they finally get around to interviewing civilian witnesses. When that happens, there's a culture in place that says this is a problem. We're going to look into it. We're going to find out was it legitimate or not. But you had, again, many witnesses looking at it saying he's not resisting. Why are you? Something that looks very obvious, right? So if there's something in place that says we investigate it right away, we get to the bottom of it. If there's a problem, we take care of it. If it was a good shooting or a good kill, we explain it and then we move on. What we have instead is silence, cover up, an attempt to take video, attempt to criminalize the people who are witnessing and reacting to what the police are doing.
Gustavo, place us into this discussion, this part of the discussion then in the context of Anaheim then, this idea of that the patterns of abuse come from the top.
Absolutely. What you've seen in Anaheim, you've seen a city council that over the past decade, various iterations, they've cared more about giving away millions of dollars in subsidies to hotels, trying to make the area around Disneyland as nice as possible while letting the rest of the city crumble. You do have right now a mayor, a Republican mayor of all types of mayors, Tom Tate, who has asked for a full investigation, not just from the local district attorneys, but from the California Attorney General and also the U.S. Department of Justice. And actually yesterday at the Anaheim City Council meeting, the City Council unanimously passed a resolution asking the feds to come in and investigate. But this is something that's been years in the making, mostly because the rest of the city has been ignored at the expense of the high and mighty. Police departments are always going to be police departments. It's great to have a citizens review board. It's great to have federal legislation that might clamp down on any of their tactics, but it all starts at City Hall. City Hall are the people who run the police department. And if you have an out of control police department, you could do all the protests you want, but if you're not replacing the city council, then you're not going to solve the problem at all.
But Captain Lewis is sort of suggesting, though, that relationship isn't necessarily equal, and that's part of the problem.
Of course not. The police department, they're always going to try to say that, well, we're the ones who are out there on the streets putting out our necks. But that's where you need a city council. That's where you need a mayor that's powerful enough to stand up to the police department and say, no, you are here to take care of our city. You are not here to terrorize our residents. And it is, you do need a brave person, frankly, because police unions, they have hundreds of thousands of dollars that they'll use to tarnish you as anti-police, pro-criminal. You need brave ones, and we'll see what happens in Anaheim, but across the rest of the country, I would ask that any politician be able to stand up to corrupt police departments and not cower under the shield that they'll shine on them.
But you have to wonder, though, in a time of economic distress, when city councils' budgets are being cut, when arguably they may need to control demonstrations even more and more because of the problems, the social problems that are occurring, whether any city council would actually go after the police. Wouldn't they be hiding behind the police?
No, they spend more money fighting these lawsuits than they ever would having to address some people in the street who are out there legitimately, constitutionally exercising their fundamental human rights and expressing their grievances.
I suppose the other pattern that we've been watching, certainly with Occupy Wall Street, a rather good example actually is that case of the police officer who was rather casually pepper spraying peaceful protesters sitting down, was the almost casual lying about what happened. Again, now that we have the footage, we can see what did actually happen. But the official statement, the police chief of the University of California, Davis, Annette Spicuzza, told the Sacramento Bee that the officer used pepper spray because the police were surrounded by students. Quote, there was no way out of the circle. They were cutting the officers off from their support. It's a very volatile situation. Again, Captain Lewis, it's one thing to talk about how people act in the midst of trouble. What about in the aftermath there? Is it routine simply to lie about what actually happened?
Unfortunately, it is routine to cover your tracks, and that includes lying often. And this officer that did the pepper spray, I don't know what happened to him, but not only should he have been fired, he also should be tried for assault on those individuals. But even more disturbing than that, I saw the full video of that. There were officers there with automatic weapons. This was a college. This was a peaceful protest at a college, and you had officers there with automatic weapons, AK-47s or slung over their arms. What are they doing there? Who's the police commissioner? Who made that ruling, or the police chief of the college? Who made that decision to have those officers there?
But how did this become so normal? It seems almost imperceptible, though, when suddenly it seemed perfectly normal to see police officers at a peaceful demonstration on the university campus carrying guns.
Well, it wasn't normal to me. I've never seen it. That's the first college demonstration I've ever seen, or where they had automatic weapons. There's big, long machine guns. And the chancellor of that college, or whoever gave that order to have those officers there, should be fired.
Is there any room for hope, Jemana, as we begin to close this debate?
I think there's always room for hope. I mean, I think we see a popular movement that's building. And I know people try to paint them as hippies. There are people who don't have jobs. There are people pulling race cars. I mean, there's a million ways to try and minimize it. But I think what we're seeing is that you can't actually quiet down the majority. And so whether it's people who are fighting for the rights of immigrants, fighting back laws like SB 1070 in Arizona, HB 56 in Alabama, whether it's people fighting back against stop and frisk like Communities for Police Reform in New York and other, around other cities, whether it's people who are fighting back on this concept that anything goes in the war on terrorism, and if you're Muslim or you smell like one or you're near one, that we can do anything we want, anything we please. I think there's this growing sense that what we're getting towards is not safer, not freer, but really towards a police state.
Captain Lewis, what about police officers themselves, though? Is there not any disquiet about the sort of tactics that are being used and, in fact, how they're being viewed by the rest?
I can't answer that because I've had no discussions with police officers about that.
I think the difference you see, though, not every police department acts the same. There's a culture of leadership, right? And so that's why I think it really does start at the top. And if these things go on and they go on and they're endorsed either quietly or explicitly, that's the culture of that police department. That doesn't mean every police department acts that way. There's demonstrations all over the country. Even there was Occupy all over the country. They were not all dismantled in the same way. And so what it comes down to, I mean, there are organizations, the major cities chiefs got together, and they've talked about things like immigration enforcement, racial profiling, they've adopted resolutions. There are law enforcement leaders who are on the record, on the books, public about this. It doesn't mean there's never a problem in the department. There's always going to be a problem in the department, right? Whether it was an accident, whether you hired a bad apple, whatever it was. But it's how the leadership handles it that sets the tone for the rest of everything.
Gustavo, as far as Anaheim is concerned, might this be some sort of turning point, and what do you make of it?
Absolutely. You see a community galvanized, a community tired. I think the important thing is now to use that energy in a positive direction. I'm completely for protests. I also understand why sometimes people will vandalize other, property. I don't support the vandalizing of property, but I think what happens is if you gather all that energy and you use it toward positive use, this is a turning point in the city. The police department, again, you need police, you do need a police department to go after crime, but I think this has finally made the police department realize that their days of wantonly just going up to anyone and messing with them are over. You can only mess with criminals. You can't mess with people who you don't like.
Gustavo Arellano, thank you very much. Jumana Musa, thank you very much. Captain Raymond Lewis,
gracias.
Thank you.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. We want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.